the sound can add so much to the image, because sound in a way is, unless it's a science fiction film such as Star Wars or Batman, for example, sound is always doing something to the image, and it's helping the image better. It seems richer and deeper because you have well-recorded voices and you have interesting atmospheres and sound effects. But that's, in a sense, it's a difficult branch of the craft because the audience shouldn't be aware, it should be invisible. The audience shouldn't really be aware of it most of the time. There's a huge amount of manipulation that goes on with editing the soundtrack. Well, sound is a physical thing. It's a physical force. It's a vibrations of the air. It moves through vibrating the air, and you feel it physically. You know, pit your stomach through a kick of a subwoofer when there's a big explosion, to sort of more subtle atmospheric effect, which you hear through the surround sound in the cinema. But they all add imperceptibly, subconsciously, to the richness of the image and the enjoyment of the drama. I start my work quite late in the day, after the film has been what's called picture locked, which means that the picture edit has been completed, and then we start with adding the sounds, adding the sound design, and that's the starting point is what's called a spotting session, which is with the director, sit down with the director and the picture editor, and go through the film, scene by scene, break it down, and then they relay what they expect to hear in that scene. To also discuss areas where there might be problems in terms of problems with the recording, where there might be a radio mic that's crackling, or the microphone hasn't been able to, heavy background noise in the original recording, so which needs to be replaced with ADR, which is dialogue replacement. So the actor has to come in and post-synchronize the dialogue, which is a very important area of filmmaking, which is not immediately obvious. So the sound on a film soundtrack exists of the original recording, which is the dialogue recording, which is the voices which were recorded on the day of shooting, and then added to that are various background elements of atmosphere and specific sound effects, which could be a mobile phone ring, or it could be something more textured or sort of more complex than that, such as a spaceship sound. And I think it's if you just saw a film which just exists as what we call a cutting copy, which is just the editor's picture cut with the basic soundtrack on, there's actually surprisingly uninvolving, because there's no mood created by the sound elements, the other sound elements, which bring so much to that. In addition to, people think of mood being created by music, but in certainly both films that we're going to talk about, there's actually very little scored music. So all the background mood of the scene has to be created by the sound elements. For example, in Ratcatcher, the scene we're going to talk about is the death of one boy, and there's no score to that. Traditionally, perhaps you might expect a sort of very heart-rending orchestral score, a very powerful score which would carry through the mood, but there's none of that. So the first question arose when I saw that and knew there's going to be no scored music. How do we create that? And we couldn't really use synthesized sounds or sounds that were sort of obviously electronically manipulated. So it had to have some basis in reality. And I think if you watch the scene, then I've laid up some sort of squealing metal rail sounds, there's some industrial sounds which create a sort of quite alienating environment and ambience, but perhaps the audience is not really aware of that when watching. They're just aware of something that's tense. There are sounds that are directly related to the image. For example, a door closing, a teacup being put down, which have a direct relationship with what you see on screen. And both those sounds generally in films were added, because the door is probably a set door which is very thin, we need to hear a nice solid chunk of a door close. We need to have a nice positive sound of the teacup being put down. And that probably on the day is not the location sound recorder's priority. Their priority is getting a good vocal recording. So the microphone is not necessarily pointing at the teacup, but we need to hear all that. We need to hear the clothes moves, the character sits up, the chair squeak as they sit down. And those little subtle sounds add sort of a three-dimensional nature to the picture, because the picture, after all, is a two-dimensional image, and somehow the sound has a physicality and weight to the image. Then there are other sounds which have no relation to what you see on screen, but which are environmental, which are sounds that could come from the environment. We see in Ratcatcher the sort of the canal bank, sort of desolate wasteland, and the sounds around there which create the background are sort of sounds we don't really see off screen sounds, which are industrial sounds, or the sounds I've mentioned before, which are the railway sounds and other subtle sounds, children playing in the street, which we don't see, which all that create a mood, a feeling of reality, and also you can use those to create a dramatic mood as well. Generally, there is surprisingly little contact between the sound editing departments and the composer. There'll probably be initial conversation, which will probably relate more to technical delivery of what we can expect to have delivered to us. But what usually there is a guide music track within the copy of the film the editors produce, which it may comprise of the composer's what we call demo music, which is a temporary music track, which they've sort of they're their proposals for how the music should be, or maybe clips from other films which suit the mood which the director and editor have chosen. So you always usually have a very good indication of where music will be and where music won't be. And I think in both those films, I mean, it was quite obvious that there was actually going to be very little music right from the off. So that was clear as well. So that was, you knew how to have a certain sort of approach, and that a lot of the burden which might be carried by music in a more traditional film had to be carried by the weight of sound. And in both films as well, they're both quite heavily related in reality, but at the same time they're very stylized in terms of their imagery, which again leads you to think, well, you can have a certain amount of leeway in the sounds that are chosen. In Hunger, the first two-thirds of the film are quite realistic in terms of the sounds that you're hearing on the soundtrack, or perhaps ones you would expect to hear. Whereas in the final third of the film, as Bobby Sands is dying, it becomes very, very slightly sort of more unreal and more stylized, more dreamlike. I felt at that moment for that final third, he's almost on the point of crossing over into, perhaps you might call it the afterlife or whatever. It's another plane, and there's a flashback to him as a boy. So again, the sounds become slightly more stylized and slightly more non-naturalistic, but again, in a way, I don't think, unless you're really listening out for them, you're not aware of. So when you're manipulating the audience, but I hope in sort of a truthful way, not in a heavy-handed way. I think that when you're creating the soundtrack, that you are aware of what you're really more aware of, perhaps the audience expectation, is aware of what you need to do to tell the story, and the intentions of the director, editor, producer, all those people who are involved within the making of a film, and the writer as well. And the first, both with Hunger and Ratcatcher, the first interaction I had with the films was reading the script before I saw a single image, and from there on, and often I think with particularly Ratcatcher, Lynn Ramsey was very specific about certain points about the sound that she expected to hear at those points. They're sort of contained in parenthesis in the script, sort of expecting an industrial background, or we're hearing a certain type of sound. And then that's an indication, and from then on there's a conversation with the director and the picture editor, as I've said, about how they see, how they feel that the sound can help them tell their story. So the responsibility is to the story and to the style of the film. I think if all that is in place and you've been faithful to that, then the audience will enter into